Today, I'm going to be showing you how to install a timing belt on a 2003 Honda Accord. This video will start where my removal video left off at, so if you don't have the belt off yet, go ahead and watch that video so you can get caught up. Since this vehicle is getting a full timing kit, I will start off by removing the bearings associated with the timing belt. I started out by removing the tensioner arm, and now I'm onto the idler bearing. Next, I will remove the two 10mm bolts holding the hydraulic tensioner to the block. If you plan on reusing your tensioner, you can see if it's good by pressing it against a hard surface like this. If you're able to push the piston in by hand, that means it's bad and you're going to need a new tensioner. However, if it's not, you can proceed to this step and put it into a vise and slowly turn the vise in, because if you go too fast you may end up destroying the tensioner. As you press in, put the pin in the hole on the tensioner body and allow it to slide into the piston hole as it compresses. Next, we are going to be removing the 5 remaining water pump bolts. If you happen to not be able to find them, use this picture to help you get them out. Keep in mind though, the 3 big holes surrounding the water pump pulley were where the engine mount attaches, so there will not be bolts in these holes. Next, we're going to be breaking the seal of the water pump from the block. You can either do this by, say, hitting it with a dead blow, or prying it in the way that I am. If you do pry it, don't pry against this actuator that you see me prying against. Try to find something solid that won't break off. Now, as you can see on this engine, there's quite a bit of corrosion where the water pump gasket was. I'm not going to say that the silicone caused the leak and the corrosion, but I'm definitely going to say that it did not help the leak and corrosion. With that being said, I've never put silicone on a Honda water pump gasket, and I've never had one come back to me leaking. Honda sends them out without silicone, and they go for sometimes not recommended 200,000 miles without replacement and no leak, so I'm going to say that just an O-ring is fine, and that's what I've always done, and that's what I recommend you do. But before we install the new gasket and water pump, we're going to have to clean all this corrosion and silicone off. So what I recommend for doing this is some really fine grit emery cloth, and that's what I found. I went and found the finest grit emery cloth we had in the shop at the time, and you just start sanding it. You don't want to go too crazy on it, you just want to get as much of that stuff off as possible. Next, you're going to want to use some coolant, either some of the old coolant or new coolant, to wet the O-ring and prevent a dry seal whenever you put it up against the block. Next, you'll want to take the pump and put it against the block. If you notice, it has a lining dowels on the inside of the pump, so you will be able to set it on there without having the bolts in there. But once you have it seated on there as much as possible, just go ahead and take your bolts and put them on there and run them in finger tight if you'd like to. Now that you have all the bolts in, you want to go ahead and tighten them down to their final torque, and to do that you want to tighten them kind of in a cross pattern, and I usually start in the center and work my way out. You don't want to work from left to right, because you could create an improper seal and end up having to pull it all apart again. The next thing we're going to do is install the idler bearing and the tensioner arm bearing. Before we do this though, we're going to coat the threads of the bolt that hold both of them on as some sort of lubricant, whether that be 530 or preferably anti-seize. I'm using caliper grease. I wouldn't recommend that, but it's just what I could find. But we do this to prevent thread galling, which is where the steel on the bolt has a tendency to bond with the aluminum that the engine is made of, and sometimes when you go to pull these parts apart again, the threads would come along with the bolt and you're stuck there. So we're trying to prevent this the next time we have to go in here, so just be sure to coat your bolts, and keep in mind that if you coat them and you're using torque specs, it will affect the torque specs, and you don't want to crank it down as hard because you may end up stretching the bolt too far or pulling the threads out by over torquing. With those installed, we're now going to install a hydraulic tensioner. Once you have both tensioner bolts tightened, we're going to work on getting the belt onto the cams. So I use these clamps. They were only a few bucks from Walmart, but they really help hold the belt onto the cam sprocket when you're dealing with other ends of the belt. It's especially helpful on dual overhead cam engines, but luckily we're not dealing with that. Whenever you get the belt, you're going to feed it down to the bottom and slip it over the crankshaft sprocket. Once you have it fed on there, you're going to feed it over the top of the idler bearing. Then under the camshaft sprocket. And when you have it under there, pull it as tight towards the front of the car as you can, keeping tension, like full tension on the belt. And then set it over the top of the cam. Test and make sure there's decent tension on the belt. And grab a clamp if you have one, and put it on the belt. Next, you're going to grab the belt and feed it under the water pump pulley. Same thing goes, pull as tight as you can, keeping tension on it, and then feed it over the top of the other cam. Now this one takes a little bit more effort because it is also off the tensioner bearing. So you have to kind of pull it over the top of the cam and pull it over the tensioner bearing at the same time. And it should pop over. Now, the idea behind doing it this way is all of the slack in the belt is supposed to be on the tensioner side of the belt. So as long as you are feeding this around counterclockwise, keeping tension on it at all times, all the slack will be on the tensioner side. Now that the belt is on, we're going to pull the pin that holds the tensioner in place. I usually use a pair of side cutters because I don't know why they have a finger hole in there. There's no way you're going to pull that with your finger. But I use a pair of side cutters, just pull it out just like that, and now the belt has tension on it. Next thing we're going to do is put the crankshaft pulley back on and turn the engine over at least twice. I'm a little paranoid whenever I do timing belts. You know, I've done quite a few. I still turn it over at least 4 times, and then check it whenever it gets back at TDC and make sure everything is in line. Right here, this is after turning it. You can see that both cams are in line. This one is a little bit harder to see, but you can see the line there on the valve cover, and you can see the red mark on the cam. They're all in line. And now I'm going to pull the crankshaft pulley off so we can see the mark on the oil pump. And you can see that oil-soaked arrow right there in line with the crankshaft sprocket. Next, we're going to be reinstalling the engine mount bracket. It's just these 3 bolts that hold it onto the water pump. Well, it actually threads into the block, but it goes through the water pump. And for these, we're going to end up putting grease on these as well to prevent galling. Next, we're going to be installing the actual engine mount, the one that bolts to the body, and we're also going to grease up its 2 bolts as well. Once you get them started by hand, you can just use an impact or preferably torque them down, but an impact is fine. Alright, now we're going to be installing the last engine mount bracket. And to do this, we're just going to get all the bolts started, meaning the 2 that are on the engine side and the one that's on the body side. And once you get the one that's on the body side up, you'll also notice a gap in between the bracket and the engine bracket, if that makes any sense. And what you want to have to do is get a jack and put it under the engine and jack the engine up so that it's somewhat level with the bracket. So when you tighten down these bolts, they don't get in a bind pulling the 2 together. Now that those bolts are tightened, we're going to tighten the bolt that holds down the harness on top of the mount. Next comes this washer, and if you don't remember which way it went, you can look on either side of it, and one of the sides you'll be able to see the ridges from the belt, and that side goes towards the belt. Go ahead and grab your timing cover and slip it into place, and then put your bolts in. Don't forget this ground. Next, we're going to be preparing the drive belt tensioner to be put on. Now this bolt right here on the tensioner is very easy to cross thread. Just look at the shape of it. It doesn't even look like it really wants to go in there straight. I'm telling you right now, it doesn't feel like it wants to either. So be careful when installing this, and as you can see, like I said, I'm greasing these and trying to prevent galling there as well. Next, we're going to reinstall this bracket that was behind the power steering pump. And now we're going to go ahead and reinstall the power steering pump. Next comes the drive belt. Go ahead and use this diagram to get yours as close to in place as you can, but I'm going to show you how I get them on all the pulleys. It's really difficult to see what I did here. I tried to remove the power steering line to make it easier to see, but it didn't seem to help much. But all I did here was I just set it up on all the other pulleys, all the ribbed pulleys besides one flat one. It could either be the tensioner or the idler. I believe it was the tensioner in this case. And I just set the tensioner back, pushed it towards the firewall or the back of the car, and then slipped the belt on top of a non-ribbed pulley. Putting it over a ribbed pulley takes a little bit more effort. Putting it over a non-ribbed pulley like the tensioner or the idler is significantly easier. Now this is where the importance of making sure those marks are lined up comes in. Whenever we looked at the crankshaft mark and both camshaft marks. We're about to start the car up. It may make you a little nervous. It makes everyone a little nervous. That's fine. Go ahead and start the car up and slowly start pouring coolant into the radiator. Now as you pour coolant in and the car's running, you'll see bubbles start coming out. This is normal. This is what's known as belching or burping or bleeding the system. Bubbles that get trapped in there can cause problems, so that's why we're trying to get all those out and make sure all of them out. And to help get them out, you can put your hand around either the upper hose or the lower radiator hose and gently squeeze it, and for some reason it tends to help some of the bubbles pass through that normally wouldn't be able to. It can also help to have the front end of the car jacked up, because then the radiator is the highest point of the cooling system and it helps bubbles travel up to them faster. So whatever you got to do to get the air out of there is what you need to do. But once you stop seeing bubbles, then you're good, and you can put the radiator cap back on and lower the car, put your wheel on, and call it good.
Hey, I'd like to thank you guys for watching. If this video helped you out, let me know by leaving a like. If not, go ahead and leave a comment and let me know what you guys think and what I could have done better. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. I'm glad to help. I try to help out as much as possible. Just most of all, let me know what you guys think, and thanks for watching.